Democracy is a slow process of stumbling to the right decision instead of going to the wrong one head on. A very good evening. This is Face the Nation, where we ask the questions that you want asked. And at a time when Sri Lanka is at a crossroads, facing an economic crisis on one end and a collapse in the rule of law, and various other systems that have been put in place here in Sri Lanka to ensure the continuance of the community and the safety of her people. Sri Lanka is currently facing several issues as far as human rights is concerned, and we are answering for them at an international forum in Geneva, the Human Rights Council sessions, to discuss what happened at the start of these council sessions. It began yesterday, and much more regarding the democracy in Sri Lanka and matters that affect each and every one of us living here in Sri Lanka. We have an expert panel today, as always, on Face the Nation. Starting off, we've got Dr. Jehan Pereira. He is the Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka. A very good evening, Doctor. Thank you very much for joining us on our show. We've also got with us here today in our studios Swastika Arulingam, attorney at law, and she is also a trade unionist. Thank you very much, madam, for joining us on our show as well. Also, we've got Dr. Gehan Gunathilaka, attorney at law, no stranger to the program, joining us via Zoom. Good evening, Dr. Gunathilaka, and welcome to the show as well. Starting off right away, I'd like to pose the first question to Dr. Jehan Pereira, the Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka. Doctor, we're speaking a lot about the sessions that are taking place in Geneva and how Sri Lanka is faring there. Of course, we do know that this is not, there are people who would like to portray that the sessions in Geneva is an international conspiracy against Sri Lanka and that we must stand against them, that they are trying to impinge on our sovereignty. But is that really the case, Dr. Gehan Pereira? What really is happening in Geneva as far as Sri Lanka is concerned?
Well, I think what will happen in Geneva is of utmost importance to our country. The reason is that at the present time, we are facing a tremendous economic crisis, and we need the support of the international community, of foreign governments, to help us out of this. And what transpires in Geneva will influence the course of those events. The eyes of the world are upon us, and this is not something that is new, what's happening in Geneva. It has been going on for the past 13 years, I think, since the end of the war in 2009. We have been going before Geneva, trying to explain our conduct, what happened during the war, and trying to justify what happened there. And clearly we have not been able to do a very good job, because what I see in the present resolution, the draft resolution that is supposed to be coming out, it's called a zero draft at the moment, but it was reported on in the Sri Lankan media. It seems to be that the resolutions of the past, what the international community, what the UN Human Rights Council has been asking us in the past, are being repeated in this resolution as well. Why? Because we have not implemented what we have promised to implement. We have promised a lot in Geneva, but we have failed to implement them. And this time, I think this resolution is likely to be harder on our country. Harder in the sense, I don't think that the international community wants to punish Sri Lanka, the people of Sri Lanka. I don't think they want to do. They don't want to harm us. We can see that even in the present at the present time, when we, the civil society, are very disturbed at what's happening in our country, at the way the government is dealing with human rights issues, we still see the international community, foreign countries trying to help us. They are recommending us to the IMF, they are giving us some form of bridging finance, loans, etc. So we can see that there is goodwill. I don't see this story of a conspiracy. If there is a conspiracy, then why are they giving us money? Why are they helping us? Why are they encouraging the IMF to support us, which we want, our people want it. So I don't see a conspiracy. I see a real genuine problem in our country of unaddressed human rights issues, and we can see it transparent before our eyes at this time. The way some of our laws are being, I think, abused, used in a very unjust way. For instance, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the Terrorism Act was first came out in 1979 as a temporary provision. It was so drastic, it was such a strong, harsh law that the then government said it's only for a temporary purpose to stop the then sort of burgeoning Tamil militancy. Now that law against terrorism is being used today.
And Dr. Pereira, I think that is quite evident even in the preamble of that very act. It states that it's just temporary provisions, but temporary, they never said how long or how long temporary would mean in that act. Dr. Pereira, it's important to speak about the government's view on everything that is happening. Now, as far as what has happened in Sri Lanka is concerned, there was a government in place, there was a president, there was a prime minister. The prime minister was forced out of office, he resigned. Subsequently, the president was forced out of office, he resigned. Now there's a new president, there's a new government, there's a new prime minister. However, there were calls from the people for a multi-party government. However, given the situation in parliament, that did not materialize as well. And recently, with the appointment of 37 new state ministers and with the appointment of another state minister today, it is quite evident, although not official, that this is once again a government of the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, which in all matters was appointed by the people of this country. And the opinion that the Sri Lankan government has on the sessions in Geneva is also important, because it defines how we respond to these allegations of human rights violations when the sessions are ongoing. Now, you said that the outcome of these the sessions that are ongoing currently in Geneva will be important and vital for Sri Lanka if we are to secure international support. But on the part of the government, they view this as a hostile approach from the international community to punish. Like what you said, although you said that there is goodwill on the part of the international community, that is not how the government views this. Recently, a member of the government, speaking at a press briefing, said that because now there are multi-parties, there are many parties who are speaking on behalf of Sri Lanka at the Human Rights Council sessions. There is a group representing the government saying that we will take action to address these issues. There is another group, including certain members of the Aragale, even Attorney at Law Nuwan Bopage, then representatives of the Samagijana Balavagia, who are also in the UN, but who are pointing out to the international community that the human rights violations in Sri Lanka are progressing at an unprecedented rate. And a member of the government said that, he spoke in Sinhala, and he said, "Ape rate bellata tonduak dana," meaning the international community is trying to put a noose around the neck of Sri Lanka. So with this kind of an approach, do you think that there will be any productive discussion or a productive outcome or a favorable outcome at least for Sri Lanka at the end of these sessions?
Yeah, it seems to be at the present time that the government is going in for a confrontational approach. I believe our foreign minister has said that some of what the UN Human Rights Council is proposing goes against the UN Charter, I believe. And so he's making that type of argument. But I don't think that type of argument actually will work, because even I mean, what the UN is asking us to do is to do what we promised to do. For instance, at the last session of the UN Human Rights Council, our government promised to not only further amend, reform the Prevention of Terrorism Act, also not to use it, to sort of suspend its use. But now it's being used, and it's being used against those who protested against the government. And I mean, it's not as if they were using that. That time that the people arrested were terrorists in that sense. I know that there was this excess that took place, a terrible excess, that the burning of those houses, of the ministers and MPs' houses, that cannot be condoned at all. But I don't know whether the 3 people who have been arrested under the PTA were the guilty ones who went around burning these houses. And it has been used. So the government itself has, I don't know why they are using that particular law. That's a terrible law. That law means the PTA is a terrible law because you can be arrested without evidence, without being charged. You can just be held because the police or whoever it is, the security forces, say that you are guilty, and then you're held, and you can be held for a long time without charges being placed before you. And there are unfortunate people who have been there for 10, 20 years that way. So this is actually a very, very terrible law. It should, I mean, maybe during a time of a total civil war, or you know, as occurred in the past, maybe there could have been a justification for it, but certainly not today, not in these situations where this was a popular uprising of people. Ordinary citizens, middle-class people all took to the streets. Why did they take to the streets? Because in a matter of 3-4 months, their incomes were halved, their savings were halved. And this government that was in power was just refusing to go. It didn't take responsibility for what it had done. And now, unfortunately, we see a kind of a repeat taking place. It's a very serious problem. It's a terrible, I mean, on the one hand, I accept this government is a legal government. It was elected 3 years ago, and the president himself is legally elected by parliament. But there's a question of legitimacy, of decency. When you mess up a country so bad, I mean, you can't stay on. You got to go and let others take over. At least call for another election. That has not happened. And these people who protested and who had the support of the masses of people, and I believe they still support them in their hearts, although they are now afraid to come out. They are afraid to come out because these laws are being used against them. I mean, even people like, even I am a little worried about this now, because, you know, I also went on the streets. I also walked with the demonstrators because I felt strongly that the government should step down. I mean, we don't hate this government, but they have made mistakes for which they should take responsibility.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pereira. Of course, we will delve more deeper into these matters that you brought forward at the subsequent rounds of Face the Nation. Moving on, we also have Dr. Gihan Gunathilaka joining us via Zoom. Dr. Gunathilaka, do you hear me loud and clear?
Loud and clear. What about me?
We hear you too, Dr. Gunathilaka. Thank you very much for taking time and joining Face the Nation. Dr. Gunathilaka, you too have expressed strong sentiments against the human rights situation in Sri Lanka as it goes, but many members of the government, when you see them speaking at press briefings, are of the opinion that there are no human rights violations taking place in Sri Lanka at the moment, at least. Let's leave what happened in the past as a different matter. But right now, their argument is that certain individuals during the time of the Aragalaya and afterwards as well broke several laws in Sri Lanka, and now they are suffering the repercussions of breaking those laws. Is this true in your eyes, Dr. Gunathilaka?
No, that can't be correct, because the Prevention of Terrorism Act, what Dr. Gihan Pereira referred to, it's an embodiment of a human rights violation. The very application of the PTA in any context violates human rights by definition. So I don't believe that we can say that human rights violations are not taking place at the moment. As long as the PTA is being applied, as long as freedom of expression, the right to peaceful assembly are under threat, there are human rights violations taking place. Now, what happens when people of a particular country are unable to champion their human rights in a domestic setting? What happens usually is they look for any forum, any actor that's willing to listen to them. And that's the real reason we're before the Human Rights Council. It's not necessarily because people from all the world want to hold Sri Lanka to account. It's not necessarily because other states are interested in accountability in Sri Lanka. It's primarily driven by actors in Sri Lanka, victims of human rights violations, who are frustrated by the lack of avenues to pursue their rights in a domestic context. Now, we have a history of this. Even in the late 80s and early 90s, when there were various violations taking place in Sri Lanka, when the disappearances were taking place in the south, for example, political actors, including Mahinda Rajapaksa, were frustrated by the lack of options in the domestic context. They went to Geneva. Right? There's a famous case, Mahinda Rajapaksa's case where he was purportedly arrested at the airport when he was carrying certain documents about the southern insurrection and disappearances that had been taking place at the time. There's a very famous case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what was happening there was an individual who was a political actor and at that time a human rights activist, was frustrated by the lack of options and wanted to go and make submissions before the working group on enforced disappearances. And that's where he was taking those documents. So this is the story of our Sri Lanka as a country, our relationship with human rights fora internationally, right? So whenever we have had situations in which domestic options are not available or domestic options are being frustrated systematically, you will invariably have victim groups engaging international fora, and right now it's the Human Rights Council. That's why even those who are involved in the protest movement are in Geneva right now. That's why the opposition is in Geneva right now. There are some limited remedies that one can pursue in the Sri Lankan context, but they see that these are not enough, and we have to create pressure in order to get a government that is behaving badly behave a little better. So the respite that comes from international scrutiny is what a lot of people are pursuing. And that is why we're before the Human Rights Council. I think we have to really acknowledge that. And there's a long history of this, and various political actors in that history have engaged UN mechanisms, and we need to just acknowledge that.
Dr. Gunathilaka, you said that there is a case where former President Mahinda Rajapaksa even was traveling to Geneva to make submissions because he was in one way or another frustrated with the lack of options to pursue any sort of case against the matter here in Sri Lanka. But it's quite ironic, the fact that these same leaders are now trying to paint whoever is going to these same international fora that they once went to as traitors. Because when you look at what members of the government or parties affiliated to the government are saying, they are repeating some of the older arguments that were brought forth prior to the 2015 election, prior to the 2010 election, where they claimed at the time, not the same argument per se, but something along those lines. Because back in the day, it was the argument of the electric chair. They said that the former president was going to be put on the electric chair. Viduliputua in The Hague is what they called it. And now they are saying that the opposition and members of the Aragalaya are in Geneva to maybe tighten a noose around the neck of Sri Lanka and painting them as traitors. Does going to an international forum necessarily mean that you're a traitor to your nation?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think that's politics, right? You will do one thing at one point, And then when your opponent does the same thing, you recast it or recharacterize it as treacherous. And that's what's happening. That's not unsurprising, right? It's not, so rather it's not surprising at all. It's completely unsurprising. We will see that kind of rhetoric from the government, and that's to be expected. But let's look at the question of whether it is act of treachery to go to international forum. Now, Sri Lanka is a member of the international community. Sri Lanka is a signatory and has ratified international human rights treaties, right? It is a member of the Human Rights Council. It, in fact, was at one point, it held the vice presidency of the Human Rights Council back in 2008. So when it comes to matters of importance, when it comes to matters of human rights that are applicable to Sri Lanka has already consented to that kind of review and scrutiny, right? That's why Sri Lanka has ratified all these conventions. That's why Sri Lanka often engages UN special procedures mandate holders, like, say, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, or the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of expression. We invite these actors to come to the country. We participate willingly. The alternative, of course, is to be like North Korea and reject that whole mechanism, try to act outside the purview of the UN Charter and be a rogue nation, right? So it's either or. If you want to be a participant of an international community, you also have to understand the geopolitics concern. You have to understand that you're a small country, dependent on the goodwill of many larger, more powerful countries, and then navigate that system, sensibly, right? So the problem we're seeing in Geneva at the moment, as far as the Sri Lankan government is concerned, is really not a problem of traitors. It's a problem with regard to policy consistency. The Sri Lankan government has created this problem for itself. Why? Because on the one hand, whenever these sessions take place, you send the foreign ministry to try and do some damage control, right? To manage the foreign policy situation, to manage international actors, to manage the international human rights groups, and to manage victim communities, right? So you want to save face before these important fora. But at the domestic level, you have security officials and the defense establishment operating as if they are completely, on a different planet to what's going on as far as the foreign policy initiative is concerned or objectives are concerned. So there is a total lack of consistency. And the prime example of that is the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the PTA. On the one hand, we're making commitments to impose a moratorium on the PTA and not enforce it and to reform it and replace it with a better law. And we're making these promises to the European Union to retain GSP Plus, to the Human Rights Council, to manage that situation. And then on the other hand, we're enforcing it against protesters because of the request made by law enforcement officials to actually have the PTA employed in a particular context so detention orders can be secured. So there's a total disjunct here. And because of that disjunct, we have a situation like we were currently undergoing in Geneva. And this is a problem of the government's making. And I think policy consistency, where a promise made at an international forum, it translates into domestic policy, translates into compliance from all state actors, then we won't get into this problem. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed very, very quickly and in good faith if we want to really come out of this situation as a respected, dignified member of the international community.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gunathilaka. We now move our attention in the opening round to the final member of the panel, Attorney at Law Swastika Arulingam. She is the President of the Commercial Industrial Workers Union. Thank you very much also, Swastika, for joining us on our show. We spoke about matters that are unfolding in Geneva. And one thing that, of course, stood out was this promise by the Sri Lankan government to repeal the PTA. Now, like Dr. Gehan and like Dr. Gunathilaka said, there were many promises made time and time again that the PTA will be repealed. It was brought into the legal framework of Sri Lanka under the pretext that it will be temporary provisions to deal with the terrorist activities that are taking a long time. But this seems to have fallen into a certain category of legislation that Sri Lanka will always try to repeal, or have been trying to repeal for many, many years, since many, many years, like the MMDA, for example, imposing a minimum age for marriage and those kind of matters. Do you think that the PTA will be repealed anytime soon?
I think the government will repeal the PTA, and not for the reasons we want the government to repeal the PTA. Why I say this is I want to go back in history, 1979. When they passed the PTA, it was also a time similar to this. We were also in a state of transition, a huge transition, where we were moving from closed market economy to a liberalized economy. And I think the government envisaged a lot of unrest and uprising, and they envisaged that, and they passed this, what I called a permanent state of emergency. The PTA, I would call it the permanent state of emergency, where you have emergency, but in a continuous way. It continues to be in our statute book. So they passed the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and then the last 40 years it has been profiling communities. It has been profiling the Tamil community, it has been profiling the Muslim community, and they have used the PTA to arrest, to torture, to falsely convict, to disappear people. And this has been the history of the PTA. Then once again we were in a moment of change in 2015, when there was a government which came in promising good governance, and they also promised to repeal the PTA, but they did not only want to repeal the PTA, they also brought in something called the Counter-Terror Act. And many of us, including people like myself, trade unions, communities affected by the PTA, the Tamils and so on, we immediately recognized that the Counter-Terror Act is the new face of the PTA. It portrayed itself to be better than the PTA, but it was like you remove a few teeth from the PTA and then you add new teeth into the Counter-Terror Act. So we saw this as the new face of the PTA, where there were provisions of surveillance, there were provisions where the police can produce secret reports before the court, there was provisions where people detained under the terror law will now be produced before court and they have to admit guilt before even a trial starts, and so on. Several provisions of rehabilitation and so on. So we saw that as a new face of PTA, because anyway PTA is jaded, 40 years long and so on. So we opposed it, and then of course the election came, and when the new government came in, they scrapped the idea and they said that they're going to bring in a new counter-terror legislation. And now once again we find ourselves in this moment in history where we are in a deep crisis, and it does not take a stretch of imagination to realize that there is going to be huge unrest. People are going to go into starvation, people are already missing meals in a day, people are already in a state of crisis, and it's going to get worse. And the government is anticipating unrest, and they are introducing this something called the National Security Act under the promise that they would repeal the PTA. So when we say repeal the PTA, when human rights actors say repeal the PTA, when lawyers say repeal the PTA, who have worked on PTA, now for instance I have worked on PTA cases for more than 10 years. So when I say repeal the PTA, I say repeal the PTA full stop. There is no other follow-up laws, there is no other counter-terror laws, there is no other national security laws. And I say this because we have a legal framework. We have provisions in the penal code, we have passed other anti-terror legislations. So we have a framework in which we can deal with acts of terror. I use the word terror in quotation because I don't like the word terrorism, but anyway, in times of violence, in times of mass violence, we have laws to deal with this situation. And without actually transparently studying the existing laws which are there to deal with acts of mass violence, the government now wants us to trust them. The same government which brought the Counter-Terror Act, they want us to trust them and say, we're going to bring in this National Security Act, which is going to be in keeping with international standards. And let me also say, international standards on counter-terror is no better than what we have in Sri Lanka. And sometimes this is seen as, when I say repeal the PTA and don't follow it up with the National Security Act, it's seen as kind of like an extreme position. And people can't imagine a state without anti-terror laws or terror laws. But I would like to respond to that by saying, when the PTA was passed in 1979, the Prevention of Terrorism Act was compared to the apartheid laws of South Africa. That's how draconian it was, that's how bad it was. It was compared to the apartheid laws of South Africa. And apartheid laws have since then been abolished. No one says it's radical to abolish apartheid laws. Just like at one point slavery laws were the norm, and people thought radically and they abolished slavery laws because it goes against human dignity. There was a time when LGBTQI community were illegal, and now we can't even imagine saying that it goes against any form of human rights and human decency to say LGBTQI rights are illegal. So that is how society transition, that is how democracy is expanded. So I think we need to start asking ourselves, what is this concept of terror? Why do we have laws which empower the executive, which empowers the president, which empowers the law enforcement and subordinates the judiciary, cuts the powers of the judiciary so much so that when you have a terror law and when you produce a person before the judiciary under a terror law, the judiciary has no power to discharge a person, however innocent he may be. So we need to ask ourselves this question and ask ourselves, do we actually need an anti-terror law? Do we actually need a terror law replacing the PTA under the guise that it is going to be according to international standards?
Swastika, we've also received some questions from our viewers. One question quite pertinent to what you were saying. This viewer says that many innocent civilians were punished since the civil war broke out under the PTA and many other anti-terror legislations, but there was no hue and cry about it from the masses because they weren't affected. Many people besides the north and the east weren't affected by this. But now, as the saying goes, they finally came for us, and people have really understood the situations or the context in which these anti-terror laws are used, and it's quite obvious as to what really is happening in Sri Lanka right now. But speaking on this complete abolition of the anti-terror law, you said, not only you, but also the governor of the central bank recently speaking at an event said that the Aragalaya protest was just the beginning. That was not really the most affected people in the country coming out. It was somewhere around the middle classes coming out after having a conceptual change, after really having their eyes opened into the level of corruption that has been going on in our country, that it led to a point where we are now bankrupt. It was the middle classes that spearheaded the Aragalaya, and according to the central bank governor, the next series of protests will be from people who cannot find food to eat. And when it comes to that point, according to what the governor said, he said that it would be impossible to prevent bloodshed at a time like that. Now, you said that the anti-terror laws should be repealed completely, full stop. Now, and you also said that the government is anticipating a lot of violence in the future because of the situation in Sri Lanka. But do you think it is wise on the part of the government to completely do away with these laws when they are anticipating so much violence? How do you reckon the government would deal with such violence, or the government should deal with such violence in the future?
The Tamil community, because the first question was about minorities and how the PTA was used against the Tamil community. The Tamil community was peacefully asking for legitimate political rights, the right of language, the right not to be denied land, the right to exercise, to live with dignity in a country which is majority Sinhala Buddhist. So it was peacefully asking for decades, and when the government stopped listening to it, then that broke out into violence, and then we had 30-year-long civil war where thousands of youth, mostly Tamil because the war happened in the north and the east, but also from other communities, died. And of course the government responded to it by using the Prevention of Terrorism Act against the Tamil community. But how I would see this is that despite the fact that people see the PTA as legitimately used against people considered to be the LTT or terrorist or whatever, legitimately used against them, what I would say is that the PTA did not prevent the civil war or did not bring the civil war to an end. The civil war was a war where military troops were sent to the north and it was crushed on the ground. It was not crushed by way of an anti-terror law. It was crushed by war. So when it comes to when we talk about the civil war and we talk about the PTA did not do anything to prevent the civil war, or it did not do anything to end the civil war. All what the PTA did was, after the civil war ended, they as I said, they profiled the Tamil community as terrorists, and everyone in the Tamil community was considered a terrorist, including myself. Once you're a Tamil, then you're automatically a terrorist. So that is how I would like to respond to the that comment which came. But connecting that to what we're having right now, a food crisis, an economic crisis, where people are going to come out on the streets because they have absolutely nothing to lose. The government wants to now crush this anticipated violence with laws like the National Security Act. What I would say is that if the government is forcing a problem coming, if the government is forcing that people are going to come out to the streets because they are going to starve, if the government is forcing that people are going to come to the street because they see a lack of opportunities, what should a sensible government do? They should focus on, for instance, food production. Has the government done that? No. So then you're not looking into dealing with the root causes of the problem, just like what the government never did with the Tamil community. The root cause of the problem was not the fact that members of the Tamil community came with arms. The root cause of the problem was a political question which the Tamil community was raising. So just like 10-15 years ago, the government never dealt with the root causes of the Tamil problem. Now the government is not dealing with the root cause of the economic crisis, and instead, just like what it did 10 years or more ago, is going to do the same to the south, is going to crush people's legitimate uprising by using laws like the National Security Act, or if the PTA remains the PTA, but I think they will use the National Security Act, and they're going to try and crush people who are going to come in thousands. And we are going to once again, just like the central bank governor foresaw, we are once again we might be seeing bloodshed, and the government is not doing anything about it. So is the answer to the question the passing of a new counter-terror legislation and penalizing and punishing people and framing them as terrorists when they come before on the streets raising legitimate concerns, or is the answer to actually address the root cause of the problem? In connection to that, I also want to touch on what is happening right now, because you made a comment on it before about the fact that the government is arresting protesters by saying there were certain acts within the protests which are criminal. For instance, them entering into public buildings are criminal. Trespassing, unlawful assembly. So now they are arresting people in thousands, and now they are making them criminal. And the interesting thing about making the protesters or framing them as criminals and terrorists is that the current president is only the president because the Aragalia forced the previous president to resign after the July 9th uprising. So now if he is coming and framing protesters as criminals, and now if he is coming and framing protesters as terrorists, then automatically his position as a president also becomes questionable, whether he also benefited from criminal acts, whether he also benefited from acts of terror. Then automatically he also can be classified as a person benefiting from these criminal acts and these acts of terror. So then he himself is delegitimizing his presidency when he arrests people under criminal laws, when he arrests people under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So I also want to make that comment, because it does not make any sense to go after protesters because the president is making his own position questionable when he does that.
Swastika, just before we cross over to a short commercial break, you said that the government is not really doing anything to address these issues that the people are facing. They've appointed 37 new state ministers, hopefully to serve the people. Don't you see this as a positive development?
One of the state ministers whom the government has appointed was seen on May 9th attacking protesters. So that is the credibility, if that is the kind of ministers, and then of course I can talk about others also, but if that is the kind of cabinet which the government has appointed, leave out whether it's 37, leave out whether they are going to do anything or not, already the government has lost credibility. This is on top of the fact that Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe does not have popular support. The only support he has is of the military and this perceived support from the international community, which is also slowly being chipped away. So, and of course the 134 members of parliament who voted for him. So he is already an unpopular president, on top of the fact that now he's appointing a 37-member cabinet. Within that cabinet, we have people who have committed crimes against people. And if that is the way you're going to deal with this crisis, or that is the way you're going to, I don't know what the president is thinking, honestly, when he does things like this, because the crisis is real and people are already, as I said, I'm a trade unionist, so I travel to the free trade zones. I already see workers skipping meals. I already see workers not consuming proper meals per day. Children are not going to school because the parents can't afford transport. So many things happening already. This is for workers who have employment. Imagine the people who have lost their employment because there is no jobs. So the crisis is already here and is going to get worse. And the president is just making a mockery of this whole situation by appointing 37 cabinet ministers, by appointing people whom the people who have committed crimes against people. This is what the president is doing.
Thank you very much, Swatsika. Of course, we will delve deeper into these matters after a short commercial break. Of course, on one point that you said that when the minorities were persecuted in the north, it was not just people who were involved in terrorism, it was the entire community or the entire minority Tamil community that was branded or labeled as terrorists. We saw the same happening to the Muslim community in Sri Lanka following the April 21st attacks. But I believe it's safe to say now that we are all in the same boat, because everyone in Sri Lanka who are suffering and who spoke out against what happened to the country, of the leaders of our country elected by the people and who swore to serve the people, pushed us into bankruptcy. Now everybody is branded as a terrorist. We will be right back after this short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Face the Nation.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
කතාවයි ක්‍රියාවයි අතර වෙනස අහවර නොවන මෙහෙවර ජාතික මෙහෙවර
මේ තියෙන කුෂ්කර්මාන්තයේ ප්‍රශ්න
පහුණාට කමක් නැහැ ගොවිතැන් කරන්න අපි වන්දි දෙනවා වීවල ඉහළ මිලක් දෙනවා ලෝකෙ නැති කතන්දර හිටපු ඇමතිවරු කිව්වා
ලෝකෙ කිසි රටක කුෂ්කර්මාන්තය අඩාල වෙලා නැහැ චීනය ජපානය වගේ රටවල ගොයියට සහන ක්‍රම දීලා ඒ ගොයියා ගොවිතැනෙන් ගලවගෙන තියෙනවා
ඔබේ ආගම රට මේක තිබ්බොත් ඔබ ජීවත් වේ අපි බොහෝ දේවල් ක්‍රියාවට නැංවිය යුතු කාලය ලැබිලා තියෙනවා
හැම කෙනෙකුටම පුළුවන් ටුවරිසම් වලට දායක වෙන්න. ලංකාව වටේට මුහුද තියෙනවා. ලංකාවේ කිසිම තැනක විදේශිකයෙකුට කන්න සී ෆුඩ් එකක් නැහැ.
වැඩකට ඇති කතාබහක ඉඩකඩ සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 10:00ට TV1 ඔස්සේ.
Welcome back. You're watching Face the Nation. We're in the second round of Face the Nation, of course, where the floor is open for questions from our journalist here today. We've got today our journalist Disal Kapuge. So, Disal, over to you.
Thank you, Shalan. So, I'd like to direct my question to Dr. Jehan Pereira. Now, we see that Sri Lanka is going through a very critical time, obviously, and now more than ever before, we've had to seek the goodwill of the international community, obviously, for assistance and other concessions to mitigate the crisis that we are currently facing. And a lot of people have expressed, I would say, valid worry or concern over the UNHRC session currently in Geneva, because it could draw a dark cloud over the reputation of the country. And a lot of people are pointing out at the UNHRC session that it could in fact damage the goodwill that we have with some countries, and that it could pose an effect on the assistance that we are expecting from international communities, including the IMF. So in your opinion, is this a fact true? Is this statement true? Does it have an effect on the assistance that we are about to receive from the international community?
Well, the IMF itself has said that for their money to come in, that they want both political stability in the country, as well as they also want sort of accountability, transparency of transactions, etc. So, to the extent that Sri Lanka can show that it is going to follow the rule of law and human rights, not just the rule of law, because the law can be an unjust law, like the Prevention of Terrorism Act is a law, but utilizing it in a time of peace, you know, where there have been some incidents, but it's not a time of war and terrorism, and to use it makes it unjust. So, to the extent that the government can show the international community that it is going to respect human rights and build political stability, I think they can actually create a good impression of the country. So it's within their power to do so, rather than go and make all these arguments about, you know, whether that what the international community, what the UN Human Rights Council is doing is against the UN Charter. I mean, those arguments might be, you know, it's in a way they're good debating points, but it's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to help the problem. But having said that, my feeling is that the international community, the foreign countries, they mean well by Sri Lanka. They want to help us. That's why countries like India, the United States, Japan, they're all they're giving us assistance even now. Even in the midst of all these problems that we are having and violations and bad things that are happening, they are trying to help us. And also, it's significant in the what I see as in the UN Human Rights Commissioner's report. What she's not asking for economic sanctions against the country, but she is doing something it's something quite new. She's asking for targeted sanctions, targeted against.
Yes, can you actually explain the difference? Because even I was confused of the difference. Targeted sanctions and economic sanctions.
Yeah, the targeted sanctions are against individuals.
Right.
Individuals who have committed human rights violations, individuals who have, and they're bringing in economic crimes, which we have started talking about, that there have been economic crimes committed in our country, acts of corruption that have destroyed our economy, that have destroyed the lives of people, which is on a mass scale. It's worse than, you know, sometimes individual acts of violence, because this is across the board. So the UN Human Rights Commissioner has asked for has asked countries to consider the use of what they call universal jurisprudence, universal jurisdiction, where even if acts of violations have taken place outside of those countries, say in Sri Lanka, people who have done those wrong things can be dealt with in that foreign country.
Yeah, but then again, Dr. Jehan, now the question may arise, how do you prove the guiltiness of such individuals? Under which court would they be trialed for these issues? And also specifically in terms of human rights violations. Now, it's very, I would say, vague in sense of depicting what has happened to the country. Like, for example, mismanagement of the country, does that fall under violation of human rights? If so, how will these these charges be brought forward? On what grounds exactly?
Now, in the last UN session, the Human Rights Council mandated the setting up of an investigative unit in Geneva to look at Sri Lanka and ascertain what type of wrongs were being committed, what type of violations, to keep a track of them, to collect information. So there will be a lot of information that now they are collecting. And if a person has evidence against that person, and that person is in a foreign country, those foreign courts can take those people in, and put them on trial. This happened even in the case of a head of state such as President Pinochet of Chile. He had to go through this process, and so it can happen. I think there are examples of even we read. I mean, some months ago, I saw that even Tamil militants who had committed human rights violations here were taken to task or put on trial in foreign countries, in Germany, I believe. So it is something that is what the UN Human Rights Commissioner is recommending.
Dr. Pereira, before we move on any further, I think there's a need for clarification about a statement that you made earlier when you said that it would have been all right to use the PTA during times of civil war. One of our viewers have put forward a question saying that does it mean that it is all right to use the PTA against the minority communities in Sri Lanka, more specifically the Tamil communities in the north and the east, and now when it's used against the majority community in the south, that it's bad. Is that what you tried to mean by that?
No, I didn't mean that it should be used against the minorities. But when there is a situation of war and acts of terrorism, there were acts of terrorism that took place during the war. For instance, the central bank was brought down, and
so in your view,
died.
Dr. Pereira, what should there be a definition for the word terrorism in Sri Lanka? Because to my knowledge, there isn't, and that's also one of the issues that the PTA is having. Should there be a definition? How would you define it?
It's very. It's an act that creates. That terror and harms the lives of people. That's how I would see it, of innocent people. And so there are times when those things happen, and I think there need to be also laws that enable that type of deed and that type of person or terrorist to be apprehended before they explode a bomb that might kill 100 people. These laws are there in other countries also. The problem is the use of this law. The use of this law outside of a situation of war or of terrorism against people who have been protesting. And of course, there is the case of these 70 houses being torched. But I don't think that the people who are being currently
persecuted under the law
were those who went and burned those houses down.
Also, moving our attention towards Attorney at Law Swastika a little bit, there is another question that has come from one of our viewers. Of course, this question has been sent in Sinhala, so I will, I assume that you are quite conversant, but I will read the question in Sinhala just to do justice to the viewer sending us this question, and then also I will translate the question. It reads like this: Lanka Rajaya අපහසුතාවයට පත් කිරීමට ජාත්‍යන්තරයට කේලම් කියන අය ජාතික අපරාධ නේද කරන්නේ? මේ අයට රජයෙන් දඬුවම් දෙන්නේ නැත්තේ ඇයි? මොවුන් රටට ආදරයක් නැහැ. Meaning people who tattletale about Sri Lanka to the international community are traitors to the country. Aren't they performing some traitorous acts? Why isn't the government punishing them? Shouldn't they be punished?
I don't understand what the viewer means by saying tattletale, because whether we go before the UN Human Rights Council or not, whether we take certain messages to the UN Human Rights Council or not, the world is not blind to what is happening in Sri Lanka. The world is not blind to the fact that protesters are being targeted and framed as criminals and terrorists. So this is not something, when we go and speak in the UN Human Rights Council, it's not something which no one knows about. It's not something which is happening secretly here. So whether the representation gets done or not, the world will look at us, the world will look at the government as to what it is doing to protesters, to the fact that they are crushing our youth particularly. 3 boys from the IUSF have been detained under PTA, under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, framed as terrorists for being part of the Aragalaya. And they are being, and what is interesting about the PTA and the use of the PTA, particularly these days, is that they don't physically torture them anymore. Those days, during the civil war, they used to catch Tamil boys and physically torture them. Now the government is sophisticated so much that they use sophisticated torture techniques. For instance, the 3 boys have been kept in isolation in dark cells for days in the Tangol detention center and mentally broken down before statements are recorded. So now they're using psychological torture. So when you talk about these things, when you talk about the fact that a government which is supposed to be protecting our youth who came before the streets, came onto the streets and said, we want a better future, we want a different country, we want a country free of corruption, we want a different type of governance. And you see a really, really old man sitting as the president, crushing the youth of this country, framing them as terrorists. What do you do? What do you do? You go and speak in international forums and you say, this is the government we have, and this is the government you're helping. So condition your assistance on the fact that they don't penalize protesters, they don't penalize our youth who are the future leaders of this country. So that is not tattle-tailing, that is speaking the truth, and that is speaking truth to power. So
and besides former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, we discussed it also. He also went and took documents to Geneva, no? Because when there is no answer in your own country, when your own government is not listening to you, then you have to go somewhere. You pray to the gods or you go to the international community.
But Swastika, on that point, if I may ask you now, most people express concern over the fact that now even when Mahinda Rajapaksa went to the UNHRC, he was in the opposition. And right now we see SJB members going to the UNHRC. So people bring up a valid concern that the UNHRC sessions are being used as a political tool to bring down the reputation of the ruling party, and it has been famously used by the opposition as a very valid trump card. So what do you have to say to that statement?
This time in the UNHRC session, you also found people, lawyers who were part of, for instance, people like Nuwan Bopage, who also took part in the session. So it's not only the opposition who goes before the UN Human Rights Council session, but it is also citizens who go and raise their concerns because they think that the state is so repressive that we can't raise legitimate concerns inside the state. But how I would answer that question is that we don't, in fact, I am not a big fan of international processes, because I think our sovereignty is within the country, and we have voted people to power to protect us from violence, to look after our interests, to look after our economic interests, to feed us, to give us housing, to give us basic dignity, to help us to live with human decency. So we vote you into power and you should do what we voted you for. And when that does not happen, I am a proponent of the fact that we need to be able to have local mechanisms, we need to be able to go before our courts, we need to be able to go before accountable systems where we can get justice.
And also, Swastika, on that point now, even at the UNHRC session that is just conducted today, PC Ali Sabri said what we have been saying as a country for so long, that we do not want foreign elements coming into the country and conducting investigations. We need a domestic mechanism. They've been saying that at every UNHRC session. But have we done a proper, robust investigation internally? Have we done justice to that?
When Mr. Ali Sabri says we need to have a proper domestic mechanism, I want to maybe connect it to the system of governance we have. Yeah. We are ruled by an executive presidential system, which is essentially, to put it very simply, one person who is standing outside the system. He is standing outside the government, he is standing outside the parliament, he is standing outside the judiciary, and he is appointing, he is the head of the government, he is the head of the state. He also can dissolve parliament if he wants. He also can appoint the higher levels of the judiciary if he wants. So you have this one person who is standing outside the system and controlling the entire system. when that is the state of governance in our country, when the executive presidential model is what we have, how do you expect local mechanisms to work when the fundamental system of governance itself is anti-democratic?
So are you saying that there is no way whatsoever that we can implement a domestic system to make sure that human rights violations are prosecuted or investigated independently? Has it never been done in the country before?
The systems which have been put in place, particularly soon after the civil war, for instance, the disappearance commissions, they have never acted independently. We have not found a single answer to a single person who has gone missing in this country, and on official statistics there are around 25,000 people who have gone missing. Of course the numbers are way more than that, but this is the Paranagama Commission report. Yeah. Not a single person has been given answers to what happened to the disappeared person. So this is our track record, and given this track record, how do you expect victims to have faith in local mechanisms and local system? As I said, I am also a proponent of local mechanisms and local system, but our entire system of governance headed by the executive president is so anti-democratic. It has never served justice to victims. Then how do we go before a victim and ask a victim to trust a local mechanism when it has never given justice to a single victim in this country?
Dr. Jehan,
before that, if I could just move my attention to Dr. Gehan Gunathilaka and pose a question that has been sent to us, of course, once again by one of our viewers. The question is that when people are restrained from coming out into the streets and making their voices heard, isn't it the duty of the opposition to at least remedy the situation to some degree and raise their voice in Parliament and other forum? Has this been done, in your view, Dr. Gehan Gunathilaka, or has enough been done by the opposition parties in Sri Lanka? Because, of course, they too are appointed by the people, and as members of the opposition, they too have a role that they must fulfill.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a very important role that the opposition has to play here. They are also elected representatives, and they have to be accountable to the people who elected them. And raising the voices of the people in important fora like Parliament is an absolute non-negotiable. So the opposition does have a very crucial role to play. I think in fits and starts, you've seen that role being performed. The big question is whether it is sufficient. I think one of the things that the opposition needs to be very clear about is that we cannot continue to function the way we are functioning without having an election and without infusing a sense of real, meaningful legitimacy in government. And as long as the current configuration and the composition of government persists, we will not have that legitimacy. So it's one thing to ensure political stability and move towards economic reform, but it's another thing to also make sure that the leaders are credible before the public and legitimate. And I think an election is absolutely crucial. So one thing the opposition needs to do is to articulate that desire that was very clearly articulated amongst a lot of protesters, that we need to go in for an election. We need to replace those who were given a mandate some years ago with people who can now actually reflect the people's will. And this is a democracy, and the only real way of doing that is through an election.
But Dr. Gunathilaka, now the current administration in Sri Lanka at least is of the opinion that before election or any such democratic steps being taken to, revive the country on the social front, we need to deal with the most immediate threat to the community right now, which is the economic crisis. And as such, we will only go for an election. I think also President Ranil Wickremesinghe has expressed his view that he intends to complete the entire term left by former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and also seeing the views coming out from the government and a majority of Parliament is that an election will not come anytime soon. Their argument is twofold. Firstly, we need to address the economic situation in the country, and secondly, we don't have money to hold an election.
I would reject both those claims, simply because, first of all, let me be clear that a presidential election is not possible. unless there's no way that you can have an early election as far as the presidential office is concerned. So you're absolutely right, and our President Ranil Wickremesinghe is also right that he needs to serve out the remainder of the term. The only way that would not be the case is if he resigns or is impeached and someone else fills out or fulfills the remainder of that term. But we don't have a situation where the Constitution has provided for an early presidential election. The election I'm talking about is a parliamentary election. And of course, a delegitimized government will claim that it needs to focus on the immediate crisis before going in for an election. But I'm not talking about an election that takes place tomorrow or day after or next week. I'm talking about the opposition making a case for an election as one of the crucial steps that we need to be taking in order to restore the legitimacy of government. Now, when an election is called, there will be an interim period where a cabinet will continue to serve, and the cabinet will have to implement the policies that are already in play. So we're not talking about a situation where there's a complete paralysis. Right? What we're talking about is a situation where we plan for an election because we're planning for a resuscitation in terms of legitimacy, and that resuscitation in terms of the relationship between the state and the citizen, where legitimacy is a factor. It's no longer a factor, and I don't think anyone really believes a government that says no, we need to postpone elections or we need to delay these elections because there's a crisis going on. This is a crisis that was created by this government. And now, of course, the government has to solve this. But one of the assurances that the government needs to give, and the president needs to give, because he will have the power quite soon to dissolve parliament unilaterally. So the ball will be in his court come March 2023. He will need to answer that question as to why an election is not an important step in the restoration of this country. And when it comes to, you raise the question of costs and finances. When it comes to these things, we can always find the money for an election. People will support democracy. People will help Sri Lanka when it comes to financing an election. The fact of the matter is it is not even on the agenda right now, and I think it needs to be on the agenda.
Dr. Gunatilaka, on that point, now previously on the show, we've had members of the opposition join us, and they always tell us that practically the opposition can't do much in Parliament in terms of requesting for an election or an overturn of the government because the majority is already with the ruling party. And this is something that we always hear, that it can't be practically done. So in that sense, now that international community plays an active part in the affairs of the country in terms of assistance, and also now the UNHRC session going on, is there any mechanism where the opposition or even the citizens of the country can request international pressure or in fact actually get international assistance in pushing the government towards an election?
Well, there was an interesting thing that happened with the 20th Amendment, right? Before the 20th Amendment, you needed a two-thirds majority, resolution passed by a two-thirds majority in Parliament in favor of calling for an early election. If not, the President had the power to unilaterally dissolve Parliament only after 4.5 years lapse from the time Parliament begins. So that was the status under the 19th Amendment. And the 20th Amendment did something interesting, and it's one of the few features of the 20th Amendment that might have been, in retrospect, might have been actually a positive feature. It changed that to allow the President to dissolve Parliament within 2.5 years, or after 2.5 years lapses. And also for Parliament to request the President to dissolve Parliament with a simple majority, backed resolution.
Right.
So when the opposition says that it doesn't have the power to do so, it's right because the numbers are not there. But then a coalition that gets you up to the number 113 would be sufficient to request the President to unilaterally, or rather to get the President to dissolve Parliament. Now that's the situation currently. But come March 2023, it's the President who has that power. So then you no longer need even Parliament to pass a resolution. It is just the president that needs to be convinced that the early dissolution of parliament is in the interest of the Sri Lankan public, and then we need going for an election. Yeah.
And looking at past precedents set in maybe in other countries or in our country itself, does international pressure, will it succeed in actually convincing our president or putting pressure on him enough so that he decides to dissolve parliament? Do you think we have a chance there?
Well, okay, this is a really important question, and I'm glad you raised it. We need to be realistic about what international scrutiny and pressure can help us achieve, right? As far as I'm concerned, international pressure is important to give us a little bit of respite when things are really bad, to pressure the government to relax a really bad policy. This is why international pressure was so important when it came to the cremation, the mandatory cremation policy. Ultimately, the government relaxed it because of international pressure. International pressure has been so important in terms of getting specific actors like Anaf Jazim and Hijaz Hizbullah released from arbitrary, unlawful detention, right? So international pressure can serve a particular purpose. And right now, international pressure is, and scrutiny and review is important because it holds a misbehaving government to account. And then we get a little bit of respite within the country to know that because there are eyes and ears that are watching and listening to what's going on in Sri Lanka, the government will not misbehave. But international pressure is not going to get you meaningful, sustainable reform. There's another ingredient that is absolutely necessary, and I'm inclined to agree with Swastika. Ultimately, we need domestic will, we need domestic public demand for particular reform, right? And that is one thing that we have really got wrong in this whole international justice project, because the entire project tends to be focused on the international community as the key audience and not so much the majority community in Sri Lanka. And political actors have always been focused on trying to convince the international community of this, that, or the other, and not so much the majority community back home, right? So we have a duality there, and that is why there's a very two-faced, duplicitous sort of approach to policy making. And I think the moment we have a more meaningful, robust engagement with the majority community, the moment we have actual public demand that spans communities, that is when we will start seeing meaningful reform. So that same principle applies to elections. I don't think elections are going to be achieved or through international pressure. I mean, that can be one component. But ultimately, we need to make sure that the people's voice in Sri Lanka is heard and people actually demand it. And I think it's fair to say that judging from what we have seen in the protests, there is certainly a demand for certain things. There's a demand for the abolition of the executive presidency. That was certainly a slogan that we saw. There was, of course, a demand for the resignation of the former president, and we got that. And I think there is a demand for an election. So I think that is what really the government needs to take seriously. International pressure can help, but it's not going to be the driving force.
Dr. Jehan, speaking a little bit again about the current stance that Sri Lanka has taken in Geneva, we saw in 2015 the resolution brought against Sri Lanka was co-sponsored by the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mangala Samaravira. Now at that time, current President Ranil Wickremesinghe was Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, and for all intended purposes, he signed off on the matter of co-sponsoring this resolution against Sri Lanka, setting up to a certain degree some form of international oversight over the reconciliation process that was taking place here in Sri Lanka. But now we have a situation where Ranil Wickremesinghe, the then Prime Minister, is now President Ranil Wickremesinghe, and his Minister of Foreign Affairs, President's Counsel Ali Sabri, has gone to the United Nations and opposed a resolution that is along the same lines of the resolution that was co-sponsored back in 2015. So when we speak about policy and policy consistency, we see the same leaders changing policy. Do you think that the President has not had his say in how we should respond to the international community in Geneva this time around?
Yeah, well, my first observation is that the 2015 resolution was not against Sri Lanka, it was on Sri Lanka.
Okay.
So it was co-sponsored by our government. And I think it was a very good thing that that government did. And that was a time of great hope, and there was a possibility of change in our country. We were talking about the need to win over the majority. Yes, we have to, because if there is to be lasting peace in our country, we have to deal with this issue of power sharing between the ethnic majority and the ethnic minorities, justice between them, co-ownership of this country. Those issues have to be dealt with, and also the issues of what happened in the war and missing persons and human rights violations, war crimes, all that has to be dealt with in some way. We can't gloss over it. We have tried to gloss over it, but it just won't go away. It's just coming back, and it's there. As for the president, I mean, there are two ways to look at it. One is that now he learned the lesson from the past, and because after all, in 2019, his party lost terribly.
Not so much for co-sponsoring the resolution. There was the April 21st attacks, then there was the central bank bond scam, many other reasons I think took precedence over.
Yes. But anyway,
the Geneva matter.
It was a controversial matter, the issue of the resolution and the institutions that were set up and what was promised and all. But secondly, so maybe he has now learned a lesson from that, but secondly, I think the more important reason is that he is heading a government, a port to a government. All the ministers are port to. They are not UNP, they are port to. So I think his hands are tied in a way. Maybe his hands are tied. And he has to accommodate those who elected him. They are the ones who elected him. And that's why he's here. So since the SLPP politicians are dead against this, I think maybe that type of argument, that argument was made in the past by the SLPP politicians, the Rajapaksa party made those arguments in the past as well. Now they are being made again. But as I said, they are not going to really help us. It's just getting into confrontation. We must try and work together with the international community to address the real problems in our country, and we have to solve them in our country. We have to there's no point going and trying and making arguments outside when within the country we are divided and there is no peace within the country. Then we can't go outside and say, oh, we are a peaceful, united country, we are going to respect human rights, when within the country it's not so.
Dr. Jehan, now you've been very familiar and you've worked very closely with domestic mechanisms set in place in the past, especially during the post-war period. In your experience, how successful were they? And looking at this track record, can we expect internal domestic mechanisms set up by the country to succeed and indeed deliver justice?
Yeah, there is a serious problem of credibility of the local mechanisms. And there are two reasons for it. One is that there is the ethnic divide, and it was an ethnic conflict. If you look at what happened during the war, there was an ethnic conflict, there is an ethnic divide, and it tends to be the case that all institutions will have a Sinhala majority in that particular group or institution. And sometimes then they will think like Sinhalese people think. And there is a problem there, because Sinhalese people think differently from Tamils about what happened in the war. So we have to find a way to overcome that. And that is a major challenge. The second thing is that our institutions are highly politicized, and that's what the 17th Amendment and 19th Amendment were meant to overcome. That it should not, that when people are selected to head institutions, such as the courts or the Human Rights Commission or the Bribery Commission or the Commission to investigate lessons learned, that they should be selected in a non-partisan way or based on merit and not on political affiliation to take the side of one party. We have had also good experiences. I think the Lessons Learned Commission, the LLRC, which was headed by a former Attorney General, C.R. De Silva, which had very good people in it, like Ambassador Paliakkara, I remember some of that. They came up with at the beginning, there was a lot of doubt about what they would come up with, because they had been appointed unilaterally by President Mahinda Rajapaksa. But I believe that those persons who were appointed to the LLRC, they were mostly very senior retired public officers. They showed that they could be non-partisan in their judgments and in what they said and in their writings. But the problem was that the LLRC recommendations were not implemented thereafter.
And Dr. Jehan, I believe there were subsequent committees appointed to study these previous commission reports, even under former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. But of course, implementation is not Sri Lanka's strong suit. We're in the final few minutes of the second round here at Face the Nation. A final few questions to Attorney at Law Suhastika. Dr. Jehan said that the President's hands are somewhat tied with the majority power in Parliament being held by the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, and the former President and the Prime Minister, who were ousted by the people, being from the very same party. There were certain assurances made by the President during a recent meeting with the Administrator of US Aid, Samantha Power. She came to the country and promised Sri Lanka a grant of $60 million US, some 20 or so to help the farmers as far as their cultivations are concerned. So at this meeting, President Ranil Wickremesinghe made certain assurances. He said that the PTA will be repealed. He said that there is an agreement on certain people who have been detained under the PTA for 10 years or more, that they will be released. And for the others too, that charges will be considered against them without any further delay. He went on to also speak about upcoming elections and the controversy surrounding Sri Lanka's electoral system, since the parties don't have any consensus on that. The President boldly said that he will offer an ultimatum to political parties: either come to a consensus on how elections should be held, should it be proportional, should it be mixed, should it be first past the post, or he will go to the people for a referendum. Do you think that these are just empty words, or will they really materialize under the situation that the country is facing, also with the President being from one party that has completely different political ideologies and policies from the party that has a majority in Parliament?
I'm not sure whether they do have a completely different political ideology from the party which is holding the majority in Parliament, because there is a lot of slack given to the United National Party. I cannot understand why, because for instance the 83 riots happened under the UNP. The civil war took momentum under the UNP. The Easter Sunday attacks happened during the time when the UNP was in power. The UNP used the PTA against minorities without any kind of any difference to how the SLPP used the PTA. So I think the middle class particularly has a view on who has the legitimacy to exercise violence and who has a legitimacy to use violence on oppressed classes of people, if I may use that term. And I think the UNP has been getting a lot of slack from the middle classes.
You mean getting a leeway from the middle classes?
Middle classes.
Or a free pass?
Almost a free pass in terms of violence. And who has the right to use violence and who is more legitimate when it comes to using violence. And I always say this, people say Ranil Wickremesinghe's hands are tied, he is controlled by the SLPP, it's still the Rajapaksas who are in power and so on. I always say this, that he made a choice to become the Prime Minister, and he made a choice to become the President, and he is the Executive President. So we as the people, I don't think we need to look beyond that. For us, he is the Executive President, he has a lot of power to do many things, and we will hold him accountable to what he is not doing. whether he is beholden to the Rajapaksas or whether his hands are tied, or whether what is happening behind the scenes, or the SLPP is trying to take revenge through him, all kinds of theories. But for us what matters is he made a choice to become the Prime Minister and then the President, and now he is oppressing the protesters, and he is our President, not the 134 people who voted for him. He is our President. So we will hold him accountable and we will keep demanding from him. And if he can't keep to the promises he is making, then he should resign. He can always resign. He should resign if he can't keep to his promises. No one is asking him to stay on in power.
Right. Also, Swastika, just to ask you now, in the past, when it comes to UNHRC sessions, we've seen the oppressed minority in the country going to the international community demanding justice. But then, in this case, with the crackdown on protesters, we see that it's not the minority anymore, it's the majority of the country that has felt the oppression of the government. Now, I think it's fair to say that in the past, we haven't seen justice delivered to the minority for the oppression that they suffered on the hands of the government. But now, with the majority raising their concerns, do you think things will change? Do you think justice will be delivered finally?
I think majority is also, in the current crisis, the majority is also not it's not a one body.
Right. It's divisive.
Yes, it's divided by, for instance, we have the middle class, and we have the working class, and then we have the poorer sections of the community, then we have the farm. So it's the majority is also divided into various sections depending on their, mostly based on their economic positions and their social position and so on. And right now the government, the majority of the people who are being arrested are not, who are being targeted are not from the middle class. With the middle class have now retreated. They have gotten their fuel, at least in Colombo, and they have retreated. So the government is going after people who do not have the social clout and the protection, which many of the middle class who came in numbers during the Aragali has. So even the people who are going to Geneva represents a particular class of people. Take for instance the IUSF boys. They have been detained under the PTA. Have they done anything remotely relevant to terrorism? But where is the support to release the boys inside the country? Where is that support? So even now, I think the majority is not one body. It is divided by class, and I think that is coming out very strongly, particularly when the middle class is retreated after the July 9th uprising.
Yes, thank you, Swastika. And Dr. Gunatilaka, if I may ask you one final question. Now, Dr. Jehan and also Swastika brought out this very valid fact that now there was a sentiment brought out in a previous program here on Face the Nation where it was pointed out that now a lot of people are asking for justice in terms of the government, like people who brought the country to its knees should be taken before the courts. Justice needs to be delivered on them. They need to be punished for what they did. But then a point was brought out that we can't really bring a ruler to courts for mismanagement of a country. There are various legal issues in that. But one way that we could actually bring a person to courts and bring a person under the justice system, like what has happened in other countries, is by pointing out the human rights violations this person has committed. So this statement basically enshrines human rights violations as a way of actually holding these rulers accountable. So in your point of view, how far is this statement true? Is it actually a valid statement?
A couple of points there. One, why do we need to think about human rights only when the economy is affected?
Exactly.
Right. So it sounds strange to now suddenly think about human rights as a means of holding someone accountable for economic mismanagement. Someone should be held accountable for human rights violations because they committed human rights violations. So that's the first observation. Second, I tend to agree. Yeah, I don't think you can hold someone criminally liable for economic mismanagement alone. Right? Yes, if there's been corruption or misappropriation or theft, that person can be criminally held liable. But criminal law is not the right domain to seek an answer when there's bad policies that lead to, an economic crisis, right? So there you need to hold someone politically accountable, and that is by, having an election. I think political accountability has already been sort of enforced on the former president to some extent, because, the public called for his resignation and he was compelled to resign. So that's a form of accountability. But I don't think you can hold a leader accountable purely for mismanagement of the economy. That's not a criminal offense. I think there may be, a lot of investigations that need to take place when it comes to allegations of corruption and misappropriation, and those investigations have to take place through independent, depoliticized institutions. But when it comes to human rights, I don't think human rights should become a vehicle for people to seek justice for some other cause. I think human rights are its own cause, and if there are human rights violations, we need to seek justice because human rights are being violated. So I think I'll just pause there with those two observations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gunathilaka. Of course, we will meet you again in the final round of Face the Nation, where each panelist will be given an opportunity to present their closing arguments. We've discussed much, and the panelists will not be allowed to bring in any new arguments, but simply add on to what has already been said during the show. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Face the Nation. We will be right back after this short commercial break.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. නිතරම හොඳින් සබන් යොදා දෑත් සෝදන්න. සබන් හෝ විසබීජනාශක මධ්‍යසාරයක් භාවිතා කර දෑත් පිරිසිදු කරන්න. සැම විටම අන් අය සමග මීටරයක දුරස්ථභාවයක් පවත්වා ගන්න. හැකි සෑම විටම නිවසේ රැඳී සිටින්න. නිරතුරුවම නිවැරදිව මුඛාවරණ පළඳින්න.
අපිට උනේ ගෞරවනීයත්වයේ නැතිවීමද එහෙම නැත්නම් අපිට බැරි හින්දා තවත් කෙනෙක් අපිව පාලනය කරනවා.
ඇල්ජීරියාවෙන් ප්‍රංශකාරයෝ ගියාට වැඩක් නැහැ කියලා. මොකද හේතුව ප්‍රංශ සංස්කෘතිය, ප්‍රංශ දේශපාලනය තනිකරම තියෙන කියලා ඇල්ජීරියාවේ.
අපිටත් උනේ
ඒකම.
දැන් මේ ලෝක බෙදලා ඉවරයි දෙකට. ඒ දෙකට කියන්නේ මේ යුක්‍රේනය හා රුසියාවත් එක්ක තමයි බෙදලා තියෙන්නේ. යුක්‍රේනය ආක්‍රමණය කරා.
අද ඔය නැවතත් කියනවා මේක යුක්‍රේනය හා රුසියාවද ප්‍රශ්න
නෙමෙයි. ඒක තමයි ප්‍රශ්නේ පේන්නේ. ප්‍රශ්න ස්වරූපය එකයි. ප්‍රශ්නේ මූලයෙන් තියෙන වෙන තැන.
ඒ සම්පත් තියෙනවා. ඔව් අපිට ඉස්සරහට
යන්න බෑ. හරියට හරි. ජාත්‍යන්තර වෙළඳපොළ ටාගට් කරනවා නම් එතන තියෙන්නේ gain of trade. භාණ්ඩයක් හරි සයවාවක් හරි විකුණලා ලබා ගන්න පුළුවන් වාසිය ඉහළ වෙන්න ඕන.
මම ඉතින් දේශපාලනඥයෙකුත් නෙවෙයි ආර්ථික විද්‍යාඥයෙකුත් නෙවෙයි.
හැබැයි දේශපාලනඥයෝ හොඳින් දන්නවා.
දේශපාලනඥයෝ
වැඩ කරේ කොහොමද කියලා.
ඔව් හුඟක් හොඳට දන්නවා. ජනාධිපතිවරු 7 දිනත් එක්කම වැඩ කරපු එකම මිනිස්සයා මම හිතන්නේ රාජ්‍යස්ත්‍රී හිටපු.
Welcome back. You're watching the final round of Face the Nation. If you're joining us just now, we were in discussion with three panelists, of course, about the current human rights situation in Sri Lanka, with Sri Lanka answering to Sri Lanka's human rights record in the International Forum at Geneva. We'll start off our final round with Attorney at Law Swastika Arulingam. Swastika, you said that the PTA must go completely. You said although it's a certain form of an extreme view, LGBTQ rights were an extreme view at a time. Even female rights or female representation as far as political representation goes was also an extreme right, but now it is the norm, and anything against it is considered as an extreme right. But when Sri Lanka is facing multiple crises and when there have been instances in the past where even with having anti-terror laws in the country, there have been terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka during times of peace, mainly the April 21st attacks back in 2019. Do you really think that it is practical for the PTA to be repealed entirely? And also, if not, why? And you can, of course, make your closing remarks along with that.
Any anti-terror law, whether it be the PTA or whether it be the, for instance, the Patriot Act, an anti-terror law or a terror law, as I would call it, it does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in an ideology of what the state wants us to believe is terrorism, which is essentially violence for a political end. So, for instance, me as a civilian, I would look at May 9th violence perpetrated by headed by Mahinda Rajapaksa. I would view that as terrorism by Mahinda Rajapaksa, but he is not under the PTA. He is not even questioned under the PTA. So the state defines who a terrorist is. The state, the government would profile people. They profile the Tamils, they profile the Muslims, and now they are profiling students. So they first do that. They first create in our psyche who a terrorist is through the media, through social media, through various things. And then they deploy a terror law. This is not only in Sri Lanka, this is also in the United States, this is also across the world. Across the world, soon after the 9/11, a Muslim was a terrorist. By virtue of him being a Muslim, he was a terrorist. So this is not only in Sri Lanka. So if you start seeing anti-terror law in that light, why isn't Mahinda Rajapaksa, who came and beat down protesters who were unarmed, why isn't he a terrorist? But why is Vasanta Mudalige, Hashan, and the third student who was arrested, why are those three terrorists? If you start really seeing how the PTA is deployed on our community since 1979, you will understand that any terror laws will not be able to resolve violence, will not be able to resolve mass scale violence, whether it be in the form of a civil war or whether it be in the form of Easter Sunday attacks. It will not resolve the issue. The issues are always political, whether it be the Tamil problem, whether it be the economic crisis. The issues are always political, it's always economic. So unless you resolve and look into the root causes of the problem and try to resolve the root causes of the problem, we are still going to have violence, and no amount of terror laws is going to resolve the problem. So it's not a extreme view, or it's not a radical view to say terror laws have never worked in the interest of a society which loves democracy, which respects democracy, and in fact terror laws have eroded into democracy. It has increased surveillance, and it has crushed dissent and freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, amongst many things.
Swastika, also Sri Lanka during these times of crisis have used the PTA, but President Ranil Wickremesinghe, during a meeting with Samantha Power recently, made a statement, and I'm only asking you this question because of course you've worked very closely with many of the people who have been detained under the PTA for an extended period of time, some spanning even decades. The President said that there has been an agreement that has been reached with certain political actors who are lobbying for the release of these people detained under the PTA, that people detained for over 10 years will be released, and except for those who bombed the Temple of the Sacred Tooth Relic and the Central Bank. I believe this was the statement made by President Ranil Wickremesinghe. Any comment on whether this has actually been reached and maybe when this agreement will come into effect?
I'm not aware of, because I'm not privy to internal conversations. I'm not aware of such agreement, but I don't think that's going to really resolve the question of the detainees we have, whether it be the Tamil detainees, whether it be the Muslim detainees, and now the three students. I don't think that's going to resolve the issue at all of why you're taking people under the PTA and then keeping them for extended period of time without discharging them. So I'm not aware of such arrangements.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Swastika Arulingam. I now move my attention to Dr. Jehan Pereira, the Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka. Dr. Jehan, Sri Lanka is currently, or already has, certain factions have made statements at the Geneva Human Rights Council, and Sri Lanka is taking a stance against the resolution that has been presented. Do you think that, how much do you think this will negatively affect Sri Lanka's relations with the international community now, given the fact that we are more dependent, if not extremely dependent, on international aid to ensure the survival of the country, to meet the very, very basic needs of people, even as far as power, fuel and gas is concerned?
See, I frankly don't think that Sri Lanka not cooperating in Geneva will hurt us very much economically. But because I think the international community, for various reasons, they want to see Sri Lanka stable, especially the Western countries. They don't want us to get into the Chinese orbit too much, dependent on China. So I think that the money that we want, that we need to stabilize ourselves at a macro level will still come. I mean, maybe more will come if we show that not just by words, but if by deeds we show that there is stability in our country, that there is greater unity between the political parties, between the ethnic and religious communities, then I think we might get more than we might otherwise. But what my concern is that the international community, the human rights community, might make Sri Lanka an example of the use of new techniques of putting pressure on leaders of countries. Because up to now, we have gone to Geneva several times and made various promises. They have imposed, made various conditions, but nothing really has changed on the ground. They also don't want to adopt sanctions against us, against our country, because it will not only hurt the rulers, it will hurt the people. So that's why they don't, I think they're not very keen on it, putting sanctions on us. But I think the fact that the new technique of putting pressure on government, a leadership that is not doing good by its own people, that is deceiving the international community also by false promises as well as its own people, might be to target them individually, target them through the principle of universal jurisdiction, where if crimes have been committed in one country, they can still be tried for those crimes in another country, say for war crimes. And secondly, through sanctions, targeting them individually again, economic sanctions, freezing their bank accounts, not permitting them to travel bans on them, which has already happened to some of us. So I think that is the direction that we risk going in, because we are a small enough country. See, again, these are also matters of real politics. Because we are a small country, it is possible for the international community to take such targeted actions against our leaders. They won't do the same against, for instance, the Saudi leaders. That's true, and that's where our people, those who don't like what the international community is doing, will say this is all hypocrisy. But it's the same even within our own country. If you are a rich person with a lot of money, you can get off in a court of law. It's easier to get off because you'll have better lawyers, and the poor person will not be able to get off in the same way. So we have to. This is the danger that we are facing if we don't get our act together. And I mean, in a way, very ironically, former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was more sensitive to this reality. During his period, he did not use the military, did not use the security forces and crack down on the protest movement, because he was aware I think, and he was concerned because he has allegations against himself.
Dr. Jehan, I think that is a very pertinent point that you brought out. I believe it's because of the stigma that was involved with the appointment of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, because people who campaigned for him, people who were on his side before the election and campaigned for him, said he is a Hitler, we need a Hitler, let's make him president. So there was that huge stigma surrounding his presidency, and maybe that was one of the reasons why he wanted to hold back on using the military. But then, as far as President Ranil Wickremesinghe goes, the talk of the town is the fact that he is a true Democrat. He accepts the values of democracy. However, the use or the implementation of using the military has been more under his government than under the former president.
And as a result of this new policy of cracking down on the protesters and criminalizing public protest, because by using the PTA you are criminalizing public protest. By doing that, that policy is endangering all the other leaders. I mean, they should realize this. So that for their own self-interest, I think they should cooperate with the international community and do what is good for the people of our country. Human rights are good for people. And reaching a solution to our ethnic conflict, a political solution, is good for our country. The Indian government, which has helped us so much, has said that. In its statement, has said that they want priority given to a political solution to that conflict. They want the provincial council system, the system of devolved government, which gives the regional majority the same right to decide for themselves as it gives the national majority to decide for the country. They want that system to operate. So I think the Aragalaya, the fact that we have all suffered, whether we are Sinhalese, Tamils or Muslims, rich or poor, it has in a way unified the people more. And one of the things that made me very happy when I went for those demonstrations was to see the young people shout and say, we are equal citizens, we are Sinhala, Tamil and Muslim, we are no different. We know that our leaders use this to divide us. We will not fall for this again. Now maybe these are just slogans sometimes, it doesn't go very deep, and when actually it comes to deciding on issues of power sharing and autonomy and police powers and land powers, all the old fears, because there are fears, there are fears in our people, they will come to the fore. But I think this is a good opportunity, and I really hope that we take this opportunity, because the fact that we have not been able to be a united people in our country, divided, a house divided cannot prosper. From the time of independence, we have not lived up to our potential. We have not been able to transcend that. And if we can transcend that and learn to work together, to trust each other and work together and make our diversity a strength, that is the opportunity that in a way Geneva is giving us, and I hope we take it. And
Thank you very much.
A new level.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jehan Pereira. And finally, we move our attention to Dr. Gihan Gunathilaka, attorney at law. Dr. Gunathilaka, we've been speaking about the Geneva resolutions against Sri Lanka for many, many years now. It almost seems as if when Geneva Council sessions are taking place somewhere around February and then again in September, these matters of human rights violations come to the fore, and then they just die back down. They are swept under the carpet until they are brought back again at the next sessions. That at least has been the experience of Sri Lankans. Now, there might be certain Sri Lankans who have really suffered at the hands of maybe the government or any executive power and are frustrated about how things have been going. As far as the minority communities are concerned, it's been about 13 years since the war was over, but they still don't know what happened to their loved ones. So is this really a means to an end? What would you say to a person who has been victimized or who has had their human rights violated to such a degree and so many years gone, no justice? How would you give them hope?
It's very difficult to give them hope because there are limits to international scrutiny and pressure. So that's the important thing to understand, that a realistic take on international pressure would mean that we use it to for very specific purposes. We use it to get some kind of respite when the situation is really quite bad. And there are times in the past where the situation got very, very, very bad. Just after the war, there were lots of enforced disappearances. There were extrajudicial killings. And then we had the first resolution on Sri Lanka adopted in 2012. And I think if you look at the human rights record of Sri Lanka, there were notable improvements. And I think I wouldn't disagree with someone who said, international pressure does work to some extent. So in terms of respite, in terms of getting a government to relax a very, very problematic policy, it has worked. But in terms of long-term justice, I think international pressure is only one part of the puzzle, or one cog in a much wider and broader wheel. I think the most important thing that we need to see in the future is a real demand that comes from all segments of Sri Lankan society. Politicians shouldn't get away with saying one thing to the domestic audience and another thing to the international community. If there is duplicity, that's a very good indicator that we're not going to see justice. And that's the story of international justice and transitional justice of Sri Lanka. It's a story of duplicity. And duplicity can only be really addressed if we start being introspective and seeing how we can improve things in the future. And one critical demand would be to insist that whatever we promise the international community, we convey to the majority community in Sri Lanka and get their buy-in. And with that political buy-in, we might actually get to see some reform. So victims have to be, in a way, aware of the fact that the government can often play this double game. And the victim community needs to also look at how it's been portrayed in the Sinhala media and whether the government is actually serious and sincere about what it promises at the international level.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jehan Gunathilaka, attorney at law, for joining us on our show. That brings to a close Face the Nation for today. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Jehan Perera, Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka, for joining us. Also, attorney at law Swastika Arulingam, President of the Commercial Industrial Workers Union, for joining us as panelist on Face the Nation. Thank you very much, Disal Kapuge, for posing those questions and grilling our panelist. Of course, at the end of the day, it's the general public of Sri Lanka, both you and I, who appoint the leaders of our country, and it is incumbent upon us to hold them accountable, especially during the run-up to an election, a time when many people might seem to get emotional and vote on emotional grounds. But all of this has led to the situation that Sri Lanka is in today, where the people don't have their basic needs. So the best that Sri Lankans, that we could do as Sri Lankans, the most patriotic thing that we could do as Sri Lankans, of course, is to appoint better leaders who will provide for Sri Lanka and put her interests above theirs. Thank you very much for joining us on Face the Nation. Until we meet again, take care.